All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to another MassMedic webinar. Today we are talking about sales and operational planning with our friends from Dassault Systems. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for MassMedic. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership-based trade association for the MedTech industry, and we work to bolster the industry through education, events like this, connection, awareness, and advocacy. Before I turn the conversation over to our presenter for today, I do have just a few housekeeping notes for everyone. This webinar is being recorded, so everyone who registered for the webinar will receive a link to watch it on demand, and you'll also receive a copy of the slides. If you have questions for our presenter, please put them in the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen at any time during this presentation, and we will do our best to answer them as time allows. All right, without further ado, I am pleased to turn the conversation over to Kim Wilson. She is a life sciences and healthcare industry business value consultant for Dassault Systems. Please take it away, Kim. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicole. And welcome to our discussion on the optimization of the sales and operation planning process for the MedTech industry. We're going to investigate how to create a complete workflow and support the full process for S&OP. I'm Kim Wilson, a business consultant for the life science and healthcare industry team at Dassault Systems. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to be looking at industry trends and challenges specific to the MedTech industry. And then we're going to explore, we're going to define, and then we're going to explore the application of S&OP in MedTech. We're going to look at the critical S&OP capabilities and solution examples and what it would take to evolve to a best-in-class S&OP program. Then we'll wrap it up with benefits and value and a summary. So Dassault Systems is a global company with over 300,000 customers worldwide. We have headquarters in Boston and Paris and Shanghai and numerous offices throughout various countries around the world. We operate in 12 different industries with over 45 million users, and life sciences is actually one of our most important industries. Within MedTech, you may be familiar with one of our 12 brands, that is SolidWorks. It's used a lot in the design. It's a CAD program. It's used in the design of medical devices. Sometimes people are familiar with CATIA, which is for more complex designs. I'm just going to name a couple of these solutions you may be familiar with. Delmia is for manufacturing, and that's the one we're going to talk about today. There's also metadata, which is used for clinical trials in medical devices and for biopharma. And we use a simulation tool called Simulia. There's a whole bunch of other brands, which I won't go into today. But what I wanted to share was that because of this customer ecosystem that we have with these 12 different industries and all these different brands across the globe, that's what's really driving the innovation and the solutions that we develop to provide value to our customers. So let's begin with MedTech industry trends and challenges. So even before 2020, supply chain was a topic that was on people's minds. I remember going to a manufacturing conference, and there were numerous sessions about supply chain. At that time, reshoring was a big deal, and improving supply chain sourcing effectiveness were the two topics that I recall. And of course, MedTech companies learned a great deal about their supply chains when the pandemic really exposed the vulnerabilities that exist, both in the infrastructure and the performance of the supply chain. And it wasn't just MedTech, obviously, but it led companies to realize that they really didn't know what they didn't know. And so now companies really want to recognize the fact that they need to plan, they need to become more agile and resilient in case there are more disruptions. And frankly, many people think that, this is going to be the new normal, that we're going to always have some sort of disruption. So the best way to plan and prepare is to develop strategies to mitigate that. And S&OP can play a big role in that. So in addition to the global pandemic option, there's also lots of other things that can impact disruptions. So you've got macroeconomic and political conditions, changing regulations, which really hit this particular industry hard, natural disasters, you could have trade disputes, and cyber attacks, which of course will be on the rise. Now, MedTech has some specific challenges that are unique to this industry, some that are common. But I think one of the biggest differences is that a medical device has to be delivered to patients at the right time. It has to have the right quality and meet those regulations that are required. And it has to be the right price to meet patient needs. And what's happening in this particular industry is patients are starting to increase an interest for personalized medical devices. So that kind of throws a wrench into, the demand and supply chain specifically. So you've got to balance demand and supply. And if you don't, your patients and their outcomes can be negatively impacted. So there's also that part that's a little different from some of the other industries. You also have product complexity. Packaging and labeling can be challenging, especially if you go from geography to geography, because there's a lot of differences. And then you've got global sourcing, and maybe you're also working through contract manufacturers. That can be common in other industries as well. But it's the regulatory part, I think, that really is specific to MedTech that we've got to watch. And then inside a company itself, you've got different functions that are working on these plans, and they tend to operate in silos. There's not a lot of visibility. There's not a lot of collaboration, and that really hurts agility. So if we're doing manual processes like with spreadsheets, that's not going to be very efficient. It's not going to generate an optimal plan. But this is where an S&OP process can be a solution that can balance demand and supply and anticipate when things are going to happen. And you really minimize your supply risks, and ultimately you reduce your costs. So what are the best ways for companies to prepare for supply chain disruption? I think it's obvious that they need to invest in technology that gives them full visibility of the entire supply chain. And then they need to consider, if they haven't, diversifying their portfolio of suppliers. So what we want to do is develop end-to-end supply chain visibility. That's the ultimate goal. And many forecasting algorithms tend to rely very heavily on historical demand. So there's an increased risk in the planning process. And MedTech manufacturers, tend to have, or they don't have, I should say, a strong visibility into their supply chains past that initial tier 1 level of their supplier base. And sometimes companies rely on sole source suppliers for critical components or select finished goods. So there's an opportunity here not only to work on the technology aspect, but also on the sourcing aspect. There are lots of different things to look at when we think about how to add agility and resiliency. And some companies are exploring manufacturing, the process or engineering manufacturing solutions. But S&OP is a great place to start to provide agility in the short term, as well as at the strategic level. And that's what's a little bit different about this, is you're really trying to bring in what are the corporate goals into this analysis so that you make sure you keep those at the forefront. Let's look at the definition of S&OP. So sales and operations planning, as it's defined, looks at variability of demand and variability of supply. And it gives you a forward-looking, optimized decision-making process. And that helps you balance demand and supply with the business goals, like I had just mentioned. So business goals are a key part of this process. You could look at operational parameters only, but from a strategic perspective, when you manage disruption, you likely want to maintain margin and profitability. So you need to include the financial aspects into this whole process. There are many different goals and benefits that can result from a sales and operations planning program. And we have a lot of clients that are very effective at this. And at the high level, the key goals are going to be cost, customers, responsiveness, and sustainability. You have to achieve your business goals, but it has to be done in a cost optimal way. So first of all, you want to optimize your operational margins. You want to keep your clients happy because you want to drive positive patient outcomes. You want to recognize the increasing demand for personalized medical devices I referenced earlier. So there's that added demand to maximize service levels. And you want to add a level of agility and responsiveness for the company so that when the next disruption shows up, whatever it's going to be, the company is going to be able to react effectively and deal with it. Sustainability is a key target initiative for most people at the C-suite level. This could be packaging, this could be products or supply chain sustainability. It's an overall business goal, so this has to be taken into consideration as well. So who actually is involved in pulling all the data together so that you have everybody's viewpoint represented? It's all about collaboration. So as you can see in this chart, we've got sales and marketing, finance and logistics, and purchasing and production. There is, the likelihood that all of these different functions are operating on their own. They may have their own spreadsheet. The terms may not sync up, and there's basically no single source of truth. So we're going to explore, how do you pull all the information together with all the different functions into one system so that the best decision can be made? So we know that working with our user base in S&OP, that your process is going to be unique to your organization in some way. With the variety of companies we've worked with across all these different industries, we know that we can support whatever the uniqueness is in your particular process. This slide is a visual representation of the basic building blocks of the S&OP process from end to end. It's basically a roadmap. And it's got all the different shareholder elements who are going to be involved. The data gathering group is the initial part, and it's one of the most important because it's a challenge to pull all the information together effectively to drive S&OP. The innovation and product management group is also key with their input, because if you've got a broad, diverse portfolio of products and any new products that are being introduced, this is where it's going to come in. Demand planning is the forecasting process. You're looking at all the relevant information that can be used to forecast sales. A better demand forecast makes sure that the medical devices can be delivered to the patients on time, to wholesalers, and in some cases, hospital buying groups. The supply planning element takes into consideration the full value network of suppliers. This could be contract manufacturers, wholesalers, and then you want to balance the demand and supply. You want to optimize the amount of medical devices that you're making, but you also want to make sure that you don't have too much inventory while you do have some safety stock. The key is you want to be able to respond effectively without hurting your bottom line by having too much inventory. Next, we're going to shift into the pre-S&OP planning session. This is where all of the data is brought in, and you want to build a consensus plan. And you can use key performance indicators here that you define within your own company as to what matters to you. If you've got complex products and processes, different channels or unique customers, different types or classes of products, this is where you're going to really analyze how do you want to handle the demand and supply. It gets more difficult to develop, these possible plans. You want to look at what are the optimal plans. You want to develop one that everyone can agree with before you go over to the executive S&OP. And they're going to take over and they're going to look at everything you've produced. And then they're going to find a plan that matches the business, the operational, and the corporate goals. So it's this long chain. And the advantage here is that there's one system being used by all the stakeholders all at once, and they have visibility to see what the options are. And as you can see, the arrows go in both directions. So it's a closed loop process. So if you're at the right side of the screen and you want to give some feedback, it'll go all the way back to the data gathering side. And you can continuously update this. And it doesn't have to be just quarterly, or when there's a crisis, you can update it whenever you want. So now we're going to look at a little bit more input and outputs coming from these different stakeholders. So as I mentioned before, the Innovation and Product Management Group is responsible for new product introductions, but they also may bring in some information about end of life for a particular device. And in demand planning, initially, it's unconstrained information. And what we're going to do is we're going to shift and add constraints. So we're going to start looking at capacity and inventory and critical materials and other things that are important to be considered. But every time this happens, there's going to be an optimization added to balance demand and supply. And this is really the key. So as you're building these optimizations, it's going to be pretty evident pretty quick that this is not something that can be done manually, at least not effectively or in a time, appropriate manner. This is why you've got to go to some sort of solution that can do this on its own. You can create as many scenarios that are needed. You can do it based on whatever KPIs you want. And you can compare these scenarios to figure out what's the best choice. There's probably going to be some trade-offs because there is no plan that's going to be perfect. But as you collaborate with all of the different stakeholders, and you can actually see what these plans look like, and you can see the effects of, lowering your inventory and what that's going to do for a particular product, let's say, you can decide which is the best choice for the company. So what are some of the critical capabilities in the process? Ultimately, we're gonna take a look at that, and then I'm going to show you some examples of how this tool is actually used. So we're back at this building block slide, but we're going to zero in on demand planning and supply planning. And we're going to look at the capabilities that enable a best-in-class S&OP here. So the collaboration between these two groups, as I mentioned before, is really critical. You're going to have better communication. You're going to go with management by exception. And your plans are ultimately going to be a lot better than they were if you were just managing spreadsheets. So let's start with demand planning. There's a number of elements that go into this, but initially you should start with statistical forecasting, particularly if you've got higher volumes where the portfolio is bigger and you're moving at a quicker pace. Here you segment demand and automatically calculate for optimal statistical forecast by analyzing the information that happens, maybe in a regular occurrence like specific events or trends and seasonal changes. And then we're going to look at real-time analytics to understand where forecasting challenges exist. We're going to track how forecasts change over time and how demand planning can benefit, or be a benefit, I should say. Forecasting is a statistical process, but it gets a lot of value from the team member insights. So collaboration from everybody is key. Having the information available in the most up-to-date version is how everybody can see it all at once, and that accelerates collaboration. All of these steps are now leading into a consensus forecast. We're going to take all the inputs. We're going to look at additional information like specific products, end of life. Maybe there's new products coming online. There's some specific customer orders where you've got, key customers that you've got to hit that demand for. You can synthesize all of this information and create that initial forecast. Then you can run these multiple demand scenarios where you get to see what is going to be maybe the best case, the worst case, and come up with a plan that you're going to recommend. You can incorporate risks and opportunities in this forecast, and that will help shape, which one you're going to pick. And finally, after you've done all this work, you get to go back and check how you did. There's performance analysis analytics that can be used, and it can be used to decide if there are certain elements that you want to weight higher than another. Because you have all this data, you're going to be able to take a look at it and figure out, how do I want to do better the next time? It's because of this continuous flow of information that you're going to be able to track and improve your performance over time. So one additional thing we should consider is time and scope. Depending on what you're making and what segment you might be in, the forecasting plan might go into like a year or 2 years down the road. So time has to be something that is considered too. And you can look at things like longer term, which would be quarterly, midterm, which would be monthly. Short term could be considered as a weekly or a daily occurrence. There's an ability to also, across the entire process, to disaggregate the forecast and focus on what is most efficient and what is accurate in terms of these time buckets and at different time horizons. So let's look at the supply plan. The key elements to start with are what we just talked about. It's the demand forecast that we just created. And we're also going to take into consideration product-based information, alternative manufacturing site options, whether it be an internal manufacturing facility or a contract manufacturing facility, and then any potential transformation information that would be relevant. So there are a number of key inputs that go into the supply chain part. We're going to look at the structure and capabilities, things like resources, products themselves, what kind of lead times and capacities do we have, any cost implications, bill of materials. And then we're going to look at targets and priorities. We're going to look at the order and demand forecast. And then we're going to also consider the state of the supply chain. What is our inventory level? What shipments are planned? What are the receipts we've got in? All of these elements are part of the puzzle that leads to the supply planning step. And I think you might be able to tell based on what I was just saying, it was a lot of information. And as you're trying to manage this, it gets quite complex with the what ifs. This is really why spreadsheets can't handle this effectively. But if you are working with these optimization engines and you're using AI and machine learning to help you solve these complex challenges, you could do it pretty efficiently and pretty quickly. Now, Delmia happens to be the brand that's for manufacturing, and it has a world-class optimization technology, and it holds records, world records in optimization. So we're able to simulate and compare many different alternative business scenarios. There isn't going to be necessarily a perfect plan automatically generated, but you probably are going to come up with a handful of somewhat optimal plans that have trade-offs in terms of what the business is looking for. And when you want to consider those options, you'll be able to produce them in a reasonable amount of time, and you'll be able to replan if for some reason you didn't like what you saw. So what are you going to get in terms of your output? You're going to develop a variety of plans. You're going to have a production plan, one for transportation, sourcing, inventory. You're going to have a capacity plan. And you should probably have a financial rolling plan too, looking at profit and loss and balance sheet projections. This is going to help you determine what the supply chain needs to do and how you want to react to it. Some decisions might be strategic in nature, and they could impact whether or not you're going to buy, or you're going to make, or you're going to outsource, or you're going to insource. The supply demand process is coming up with the best, the optimal decision, so the team can make the final call. So what are the critical, we just covered the critical things. Now let's look at some examples. So first, we need to develop an accurate model of the supply chain so that when we create a digital twin, we can use that to validate our plans. This can be done manually, and with AI, you can get good and feasible plans pretty quickly. The models are user configurable, so you can address any specific requirement that you have in the supply chain. Now, the whole supply chain is going to be visible at a high level. And remember, this is going to be end to end. And you can drill down to identify specific things like root causes of a particular issue. This slide is looking at cost per entity, bottleneck resources, and demand fulfillment for a particular sales segment. The system is going to identify and highlight exceptional situations, and you're going to have the ability to identify potential issues within the plan as far in advance as possible. And that in and of itself is going to help you develop an alternative plan much faster. And you're going to be able to address disruptions much quicker by having this visibility. So now we're going to look at automated KPI-based AI optimization. So these KPIs that you've developed, these are yours, and you can have as many as you want, and you can weight them. With the complex supply chains that exist today, it's challenging to do this manually, and you don't get to take into consideration all of the different trade-offs. So let's consider, like in a given market segment, if meeting a customer demand may be a super high priority, even if you're going to give up a little on margin. But you're really focused on driving customer satisfaction and market share. So that may be one template of what you want to look at. All of that can be looked at quickly and efficiently without a lot of hours. But if you were trying to do it manually, that would take a lot more time, and you may not be able to take all of those elements into consideration. You could also think of, you've got that plan that I just set up. But maybe there's another focus, like maybe CO2 emission reduction is something that the company wants to be evaluated. Well, you can add that into the analysis too. And it would be a lot harder to do that manually. The ability to create these very quick what if scenarios really is how you get the insight on how best to respond depending on the situation you're in, and seeing what those trade-offs are going to be. Like I said before, you're not going to have the perfect plan, but by looking at these what if views, everybody has, can share their opinion and can comment on what the ramification would be maybe for their function. And then the best consensus plan can be put together. So if we recap this section on some examples, it's really for demand forecasting, you're going to be able to do statistical prediction, and you're going to all work together so that this information is shared and that people can collaborate. You've got this digital twin model that you're going to work off of. You're going to potentially be able to do management by exception. The KPIs are all in there, and AI is actually driving the optimization for you. And like I said, you can have so many what if scenarios. It's really up to you. So now we're going to look at how do you evolve to that best in class program. So if you want to have an effective process, it's really not just about the system and the technology. You've got to include the people and the processes too. Technology isn't going to work unless you've developed an effective process to support it. And if people aren't engaged and committed, then this isn't going to work either. So this particular slide is looking at the spectrum of where companies start this transformation and where they could end up. So typically, if you're looking for collaboration, I mentioned sales and marketing, but it includes so many other stakeholders. Initially, there's very low collaboration going on, and on the left side of the screen, and you want to get to the best practices, which is on the right. You want to have everybody collaborating. It's key to figure out who is actually owning the supply chain from an operational level. You want to balance the business metrics and the goals around profit and loss. And for KPIs and metrics, it's interesting. Often they're disparate and they are not considered relative to each other. There could be one metric that's super successful and another that's not doing so well. So they've got to be value-based. You've got to align them across the enterprise. You have to understand how they interrelate with each other. And then as we look at time horizon, realistically, if you're doing this manually, you can potentially do short term if your system isn't too complex, but it's very difficult to do that in the longer term. But you can do that if you adopt an AI-based optimization engine. And finally, from a technology perspective, most companies are starting with spreadsheets or a basic ERP. And where we want to get to is an integrated system on the far right. And as you'll see, we've got these dots showing where everybody is in general in this process. So hopefully that gives you an idea of where people are, what are the key elements to get started, and how you move from left to right to get to the best practices. So if we look at a typical example of a company and where they begin the process, we're going to see they've got a lot of disconnected processes. There's a lot of arrows going on here. Typically, these spreadsheets are really driving this at this point because it's a manual process. And as we know, spreadsheets are pretty static. They tend to be out of date. They tend to be communicated by email, and they're going back and forth, so they're not current. And that is going to generate some challenges. So you're going to have inaccurate statistical forecasts. Everything's not going to be up to date. You're going to have a traceability issue because you're using emails and you're not able to track any of those changes necessarily. It's going to be time consuming and ineffective. This doesn't really play into the goal of being agile. There's not a lot of visibility necessarily from a financial perspective either. And people aren't really talking to each other than sending an email at this point. And finally, you know, you have inaccurate consensus forecasts. You can't optimize these, and there's no exception management. So where you want to get to, this is how you can, and you can see it's very streamlined. This is what's available when you shift to an integrated S&OP program. There's no manual back and forth. The information is pretty direct. It moves in a good flow. If you do still have some spreadsheets, they can be integrated into the process for better control and versioning, and you can have better governance over all that data. And the benefits are that you're going to see improved accuracy and speed. You're going to be able to automate the data collection and the cleansing. You're going to end up with a best-in-class forecast. You've got these algorithms that are generated. You can organize by critical things or non-critical forecasts. And these what-if scenarios are really going to be the key here. And all of that's ultimately going to give you better efficiency. You're going to have a single source of truth. You're going to have automated notifications, the traceability, and you can track changes. So all of this is easily able to be shared amongst all of the folks that are the stakeholders here. So now let's jump into the benefits and the value. So for life science specifically, we're seeing these type of metrics. We're seeing a 35% lead time reduction, up to 40% inventory and safety stock reduction, 15% medical device obsolescence expense reduction, and a 25% forecast accuracy number. So these are pretty significant. And in terms of sustainability, you can see the numbers here, but demand planning, we didn't go into this in great detail, but you can do 30% reduction in carbon footprint if you consider the global supply chain. And as I mentioned, up to 40% on inventory and safety stock reduction when you're considering supply planning. And then when you pull the pre-S&OP and the executive S&OP people together, you're going to see an improved productivity gain of about 18%. And from a business benefit perspective, you've really got one solution environment for all the stakeholders, which means better collaboration. These workflows are intuitive, and the interface between everyone allows for quicker decision making while they're in those planning meetings. You're going to be able to prioritize and visualize the demand and supply data. And as you're having discussions about, in some cases, arguing your point, you'll be able to have that data to back you up. And ultimately, it's going to reduce costs. It's going to improve sales numbers, and it's going to positively impact your customer service levels, and ultimately deliver better patient outcomes. So in summary, S&OP is a critical operational area, and it deserves attention. And with all the complexity and disruption that will continue to exist, manual methods just aren't going to cut it. So they really can't compete with S&OP. So if your organization is still using manual processes for demand and supply planning, using spreadsheets, then S&OP is something that should probably be higher up on your priority list. And this isn't something that has to be done overnight. Your company can adopt elements of it over time. Perhaps you have higher volume that you're dealing with, so maybe demand planning is a better place to start. If you've got complex production, then maybe supply planning is a better place for you to begin the journey. It's really an evolution process that is more than just the technology. You've also got to develop a process in place in your company. You've got to bring all the people along, all the stakeholders, so that they're committed to this process as well. That's how it's going to be successful. And finally, we know every company has unique circumstances. We've had really good success at this because of all the different industries we've worked in. So no matter what kind of KPIs that you have or how complex your situation is, we've probably seen it before. We've solved it before because of this incredible optimization technology that we have. So I'm confident that if this is something that you want to talk about, that we would be able to help bring value to your organization. So thanks for your time. I hope you learned something today. Feel free to reach out. I've got my email there. I also have a link to our Life Sciences MedTech page. And then this manufacturing user community I'm also referencing on the bottom. It's something that you're eligible to join, even if you're not a customer of ours. It provides an opportunity for industry peers to talk. They can also talk to folks in our company that are experts in manufacturing, and it's free to join. I highlighted the discussion today, so it's the planning and optimization box, so that you know if you decide to go in there where you want to go. So I'm going to toss it back to Nicole.
Thanks, Kim. Lots of really good information. So if you have any questions for Kim, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We do have a few that came in, Kim, while we wait for more. One person is looking for a little more clarity on Delamia product. Is it focused on understanding demand planning? So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that specific offering.
Okay. So Delmia, which is the manufacturing brand, it starts with, where there's so many different products, as you can see, or you could see on the last page of my slide deck. It looks at all sorts of things. So the planning and optimization part is where we would go to have a conversation. And was the question about demand that they were specifically interested in?
It looks like understanding demand and demand planning. Is it a tool that can help with both of those?
Yes, yes. I think what probably would make the most sense is for us to have a one-on-one conversation about specifically what you're looking for. But the tools exist, and they're there to focus on specifically demand planning and then supply planning. And if you just wanted to get started with demand planning, maybe you have high volumes and as opposed to more complex problems, that would be the place to start. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but perhaps a specific one-on-one conversation might make most sense.
Okay. And you have Kim's information. You'll also get it in the follow-up email. So please do reach out to Kim if she can help you get more information there. What about, can you talk a little bit more about supply chain planning and disruptions there? How can you plan for them when they're so unpredictable?
So I think the most important thing is you've got to get a handle on what your supply chain looks like today. And you want to model that. So if you have that complete end-to-end visibility, and then you start looking at, what are the, you're never going to be prepared for everything, but if you start with that base, then you're going to be able to react when something happens. And you can start running those what if optimizations to say, I've got to balance, I don't have enough stock. Do I need to go look at alternative manufacturing sites within my own company? Do I need to go look at contract manufacturing sites? And then what are all the elements and the trade-offs to doing that? Because you're going to spend more probably by going outside to do that, or you might spend more by adding transportation costs to that. So, basically being able to have visibility into what all the options are is how you're going to be able to be more agile and be able to make the best decisions. You can't do that unless you have a clear picture of what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, we have one more question in the queue. Again, if you have a question for Kim, please feel free to put it in the Q&A function. Is this solution applicable for all companies in MedTech, or is it more appropriate for one or a few segments?
Oh, I think all segments would benefit. As I had mentioned before, if you're doing really complex medical device production, you're probably going to be focused a little bit more on the supply side, although the demand side can really help. But I'm just going to give that as an example. The visibility that you get across all the different functions with all of the elements going into, the financial aspects and the business drivers of the organization, you can see that when it's right in front of you. If everybody's operating in their own silo and have their own goals that sometimes are at cross purposes, that's not going to generate the best supply chain program for the company. It's just not going to work. So everybody, I think, can benefit from this.
Great. All right, it looks like, one more question just came in. 1 second. Put on my glasses here. Any guidance for a pre-commercial company preparing for launch? Is the software still applicable?
That is a really good question. Yeah, I'd be happy to discuss that one-on-one. I think what you want to take into consideration, there's a lot going on when you're doing, when you're a startup, right? So many different things. If you can get a handle on this information early on and have it embedded from the get-go, I think you're going to be able to make some decisions pretty quick that may save you a lot of time and money. So be happy to discuss that in further detail. Excuse me.
Fantastic. And again, what's the best way for companies to reach out to you if they're interested in talking more about trying these solutions or just have a question?
Oh, I think, send an email. That's the best way. So it's kim.wilson@3ds.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, we are out of questions, so I'm going to take the opportunity and wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time today, Kim, and your expertise. I do want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today, and also thank you to Dassault Systems for hosting today's content. We can't bring the expert content like this to our members without support of companies, so we greatly appreciate that. I do encourage everyone to visit massmedic.com and check out our event calendar for all the upcoming events that you can take advantage of. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Have a great one.